"Grandma, if you were selling your house next month, where are you going to live?" Ethan asked with the kind of innocent curiosity that only a 10-year-old could have. His voice floated across the long wooden table overlooking the lake just as everyone reached for dessert. The forks stopped moving. Conversations disappeared. Even the breeze coming off the water seemed quieter. I looked from Ethan to my daughter Laura, expecting her to laugh and explain whatever misunderstanding had led to such a strange question. Instead, she froze with her coffee cup halfway to her lips. My son-in-law David stared at his plate as though the blackberry pie had suddenly become fascinating. Nobody answered. I have lived long enough to know that silence often tells the truth before words ever do. My name is Margaret Sullivan. I am 70 years old, and until that moment I believed this vacation was exactly what my family claimed it would be. A chance for all of us to spend one peaceful week together at a lakeside lodge in Montana. My husband passed away 9 years ago, and ever since then I had tried to keep our family traditions alive. Every summer I paid for a trip where everyone could unplug from work, enjoy nature, and remember that family was supposed to matter more than schedules and bank accounts. I never considered the money a burden. I considered it a gift. Watching my grandson laugh while skipping rocks across the lake always felt worth every dollar. Earlier that afternoon, everything had seemed perfectly normal. Ethan begged me to join him on the canoe dock. Laura insisted on taking family photographs before dinner because she said the sunset looked too beautiful to waste. David even complimented the cabin I had rented, saying it was the nicest one we had ever stayed in. Looking back, I realized they were all unusually attentive. They smiled more than usual. They agreed with everything I said. At the time, I thought they were simply grateful to be together. Now I wondered whether gratitude had anything to do with it. Laura finally forced a laugh that sounded much too rehearsed. "Sweetheart, you must have misunderstood something," she said as she gently placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Grandma is not selling her house." Ethan frowned. "But Dad said after this trip the buyers would probably come look at it." David looked up so quickly that his chair scraped across the wooden floor. "Ethan," he said quietly, "why do you not go see if they have more ice cream inside?" The boy looked confused. "But I was only asking." "Please," David interrupted with a smile that never reached his eyes. Ethan shrugged and wandered toward the lodge without another word. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. I looked directly at Laura. Would someone like to explain what my grandson just meant? She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Mom, it is nothing. Children hear pieces of conversations and imagine the rest." Her words sounded reasonable. Her expression did not. She avoided looking at me. David suddenly became very interested in stacking empty plates. Around us, the laughter from other families echoed across the lake while ours sat trapped inside a silence that felt heavier than the mountains surrounding us. That night, I stood alone on the cabin porch watching the moon reflect across the water, trying to convince myself that Ethan had simply misunderstood an adult conversation. Then I noticed Laura and David standing near the parking lot, speaking in hushed voices with their backs turned toward me. A few seconds later, David unfolded a large manila envelope, pointed toward me, and Laura quietly nodded before slipping the envelope into her tote bag. I stood on the porch long after Laura and David disappeared into the cabin. The manila envelope stayed in my mind far more than the conversation at dinner. It was not only the envelope itself, it was the way they handled it. People do not hide vacation brochures or restaurant receipts like they are carrying state secrets. They hide documents that answer questions nobody wants asked. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. After all, Laura had never given me a serious reason to doubt her before. She had always been organized, protective, and practical. Those qualities helped her build a successful career, and I had always admired that. But there is a difference between being organized and being secretive. That night, I slept very little. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Ethan's voice asking where I would live after selling my house. The next morning I woke before sunrise and made myself a cup of coffee. The lodge was quiet except for birds singing near the lake. I carried my mug onto the deck and watched the mist drift across the water. It should have been peaceful. Instead, I found myself replaying every conversation from the past few months. Laura had asked several unusual questions recently. Had I considered downsizing? Was maintaining a large home becoming exhausting? Had I ever thought about moving closer to them? At the time, those questions sounded like concern. Now they sounded different. Around 8 o'clock, everyone gathered for breakfast. Ethan greeted me with a hug and immediately started talking about renting kayaks later that afternoon. His smile reminded me that children rarely understand the weight of adult conversations. Laura seemed unusually cheerful, almost determined to erase the awkwardness from the night before. David barely looked at me. He checked his phone repeatedly and excused himself twice to take calls outside. I noticed Laura watching him each time he walked away. They shared quick glances that disappeared the moment anyone else looked in their direction. After breakfast, Ethan asked if I would go with him to feed the ducks near the dock. While we walked along the shoreline, he slipped his small hand into mine. "Grandma," he said quietly, "are you upset because of what I asked?" I smiled gently. "No, sweetheart. I was only surprised. Why did you think I was selling my house?" He shrugged. "I heard Mom and Dad talking in the kitchen last week. Dad said everything would be easier after you signed the papers and the buyers took the house. Mom said they should wait until after the vacation because you would be happier here." He skipped a stone across the water as though he had simply repeated the weather forecast. My heart felt suddenly heavy, but I kept my voice calm. "Did they say anything else?" Ethan thought for a moment. "Dad said nobody should tell you yet because it would ruin the trip." Before I could ask another question, Laura called from the cabin, waving for Ethan to come back. He ran toward her without another thought. I remained standing at the edge of the lake, staring across the still water. If Ethan had repeated that conversation exactly as he heard it, then someone believed I was going to sign papers that I had never even seen. I spent the rest of the morning pretending everything was normal. I smiled when Ethan proudly showed me the smooth stones he had collected along the shoreline. I complimented Laura on choosing a wonderful restaurant for lunch. I even laughed at one of David's stories, although I barely heard a word he said. Inside, however, something had changed. I was no longer listening to what my family wanted me to hear. I was paying attention to everything they wished I would overlook. Years of teaching high school had taught me one lesson that never failed. People often revealed themselves in the small moments between conversations. They forgot who was watching when they believed nobody was suspicious. That afternoon, everyone decided to rent kayaks except me. I claimed my knees were bothering me and said I preferred reading on the lodge porch. Laura looked relieved far more quickly than any concerned daughter should have. "Are you sure you will be all right by yourself?" she asked. "I will enjoy the quiet," I answered with a smile. As soon as their cars disappeared down the gravel road toward the marina, I walked back inside the cabin. I had no intention of searching through anyone's belongings. That crossed a line I was not prepared to cross. But I also refused to ignore the questions that had been piling up since Ethan innocently spoke at dinner. While making another cup of coffee in the kitchen, I noticed a folded brochure sticking halfway out of a canvas tote bag resting on one of the chairs. It was the same tote Laura had been carrying the night before. The top of the brochure displayed the logo of a local real estate company. I did not touch it. I simply read the words that were visible: Luxury Lake and Mountain Properties. Beneath the title was a handwritten appointment time for the following Tuesday. We were scheduled to return home on Monday. Why would Laura need information about Montana real estate when we lived hundreds of miles away in Colorado? Before I could think any further, I heard footsteps on the front porch. I stepped away from the table just as Carol Reynolds, my oldest friend, knocked on the screen door with a cheerful smile. She and her husband happened to be staying at the same resort for their own anniversary trip. "I thought I would surprise you," she said. "Everyone else?" "Out kayaking," I replied. We sat outside overlooking the lake, and after a few minutes she tilted her head. "Margaret, something is bothering you." I tried to dismiss it, but Carol had known me for more than 40 years. Eventually, I told her about Ethan's questions without adding my own conclusions. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she became unusually quiet. "There is something I have been debating whether to tell you," she said slowly. "About 3 weeks ago, I attended a charity dinner in Denver. I happened to overhear David talking with a man who introduced himself as a real estate broker. I only caught one sentence before they walked away. David said, 'She trusts Laura completely. Once the paperwork is ready, convincing her will be the easy part.'" Carol reached across the table and gently touched my hand. At the time, I assumed they were helping someone else. "Margaret, were they talking about you?" Carol's question lingered between us long after the words left her mouth. I wished I could dismiss it as coincidence, but too many pieces were beginning to fit together. Ethan's innocent comments, the hidden envelope, the whispered conversations, the strange brochure. None of them proved anything by themselves, yet together they formed a picture that I could no longer ignore. I honestly do not know, I admitted. But if they were talking about me, then they have been planning something without my knowledge. Carol looked out across the lake before speaking again. Margaret, you have always trusted Laura. That is one of the things I admire most about you. But trust should never replace questions. Those words stayed with me after she left. I spent the rest of the afternoon acting exactly as everyone expected. I joined the family for a short walk through the nearby trails. I admired the mountain views. I laughed when Ethan pointed out a deer grazing near the trees. I never mentioned the conversation with Carol. If someone was hiding something from me, I wanted them to continue believing I knew nothing. During dinner, I noticed another small detail. David kept checking his watch every few minutes. Around 7 o'clock his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, stood up almost immediately, and apologized. I have to return a work call. It will only take a minute. Laura nodded without asking who had called. It felt rehearsed, almost expected. I watched him step outside onto the back deck where the cell signal was stronger. The sliding glass door remained slightly open. I had no intention of listening, but as I walked toward the coffee station nearby, a few words drifted inside with the evening breeze. Tomorrow morning. Yes, before checkout. She still has no idea. My footsteps stopped for only a second before I continued pouring my coffee. I refused to stand there and eavesdrop. If I was going to uncover the truth, it would be through facts rather than assumptions. When David returned, he smiled as though nothing had happened. Everything all right? I asked casually. Just work, he answered without hesitation. Clients never seem to take vacations. His response sounded smooth, but his hands betrayed him. He reached for his water glass twice before realizing it was directly in front of him. Laura quickly changed the subject by asking Ethan about school, and the conversation moved on. Later that evening, everyone gathered in the lodge's game room. Ethan convinced me to play a round of checkers while the others wandered between the pool table and fireplace. Halfway through our game, Laura's tote bag slipped from the back of a chair and fell onto the wooden floor. Several items scattered across the room. Laura rushed toward it faster than seemed necessary, but one folded sheet of paper slid several feet away and stopped near my shoes. I bent down to pick it up before she could reach it. At first glance it looked like an ordinary printed itinerary. Then my eyes caught a bold heading near the top of the page. It read, Property Transfer Meeting. Beneath the title was a scheduled appointment for Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock. My home address appeared directly underneath it. For a brief moment, the room disappeared around me. I looked at the paper in my hand, then at Laura. Her face lost all color before she quickly forced a smile that looked more nervous than reassuring. She stepped toward me and reached for the document. That is only something from work, she said a little too quickly. I must have grabbed the wrong papers before we left. I handed it back without arguing. Interesting, I replied calmly. I did not realize your work involved my home address. The smile vanished. David immediately walked over and slipped the paper back into the tote bag before anyone else could read it. It is complicated, he said. Nothing for you to worry about. I nodded as though I accepted the explanation. Inside, however, every instinct I had developed over 70 years told me they were frightened, not embarrassed. Frightened people rush to hide things. Honest people explain them. The evening continued with board games and small talk, but the atmosphere had shifted. Laura laughed a little too loudly. David barely spoke unless someone asked him a direct question. Ethan, thankfully, remained blissfully unaware of the tension surrounding the adults. Before heading to bed, he hugged me and whispered, Tomorrow can we go fishing together before breakfast? I smiled. I would like that very much. His simple kindness reminded me why I needed patience. Whatever was happening had nothing to do with him. Early the next morning, while the rest of the cabin remained quiet, Ethan and I walked to the dock, carrying 2 fishing poles. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the mountains like polished glass. We sat side by side without saying much for several minutes. Finally, Ethan looked up at me. Grandma, are you mad at Mom and Dad? Children often ask questions adults spend weeks avoiding. Why would you think that? I asked gently. He shrugged. Because they keep telling me. Not to mention grown-up conversations anymore. I kept my eyes on the water. Did they tell you that after dinner? He nodded. Dad said I surprised everybody. Mom said some things are family business. I smiled softly. They are right about one thing. Sometimes adults need to solve adult problems. But you did nothing wrong. Ethan seemed relieved. A few minutes later, he pointed excitedly toward the lodge. There is Mom. Laura was walking quickly across the lawn, scanning the shoreline until she spotted us. When she reached the dock, she looked more anxious than angry. Breakfast is almost ready, she said. Then she turned to Ethan. Sweetheart, why do you not run ahead and save Grandpa? Save David a seat. Ethan laughed and ran toward the cabin. As soon as he was out of earshot, Laura sat beside me. She stared across the lake before speaking. Mom, if I asked you to trust me for just a few more days, would you? I studied her face carefully. She looked exhausted, as though she had not slept much either. Trust you about what? I asked quietly. She opened her mouth to answer, but before a single word came out, David appeared at the end of the dock holding the same manila envelope I had seen on the first night. He stopped when he noticed us together, then called out, Laura, the attorney is on the phone. He says there has been a problem with the documents. Laura immediately stood up from the dock, but I gently reached out and touched her arm before she could leave. You were about to answer my question, I said quietly. She looked from me to David, who remained standing several yards away with his phone pressed against his ear and the manila envelope tucked beneath his arm. For a moment, she looked like a little girl again, caught between telling the truth and protecting someone she loved. Then she lowered her eyes. I will be right there, she called back to David. He hesitated before turning toward the lodge, still speaking into the phone. As soon as he disappeared around the corner, Laura let out a slow breath. Mom, things have become more complicated than we expected. I folded my hands in my lap. Complicated usually means someone has not been honest. She did not argue. Instead, she stared across the calm water. We thought we were helping you. That sentence surprised me more than I expected. Helping me do what? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Finally, she whispered, we were afraid you were living alone in a house that had become too much for you. I listened without interrupting. Who is we? I asked. David and I, she answered. Mostly David at first. Then I agreed with him. I nodded slowly. That still does not explain why my grandson believed my house had already been sold. Tears formed in her eyes. Because David was convinced you would eventually agree once you saw all the options. Before I could respond, David returned, walking much faster than before. His expression had completely changed. Laura, we need to leave now, he said firmly. The attorney cannot reach the title office. He stopped when he realized I was watching him. Is everything all right? I asked. Just paperwork, he replied with a smile that looked carefully practiced. Nothing important. I stood up. Interesting. Yesterday, I was apparently selling my house. Last night, there was a property transfer meeting with my address on the document. This morning, there is an attorney calling about paperwork that is somehow also nothing important. David did not answer immediately. Margaret, I think we should discuss this after we get home. I think we should discuss it now, I replied calmly. The silence between us lasted several long seconds before Laura quietly said, Mom, there is something you need to understand. Nobody has sold your house. I felt a brief sense of relief, but it vanished almost instantly when she continued. Nothing can happen unless you sign. That single sentence revealed more than she intended. They already had documents. They already had a process. They were only waiting for my signature. David quickly interrupted. Laura. She stopped talking immediately. The three of us walked back toward the lodge without another word. During lunch, everyone behaved as though nothing unusual had happened. Ethan happily described the fish he almost caught. Other families laughed around us. Only our table felt strangely quiet. After the meal, I excused myself and returned to my room. I locked the door, sat beside the window, and finally took out my phone. I searched my email for recent messages from my attorney, expecting to find nothing unusual. Instead, one unread message from 3 days earlier caught my attention. The subject line read, Margaret, I received an unexpected request regarding your property. Please call me before signing anything. My heart began beating faster as I stared at the message on my phone. 3 days earlier, while I had been enjoying the first evening of what I believed was a peaceful family vacation, my attorney had already been trying to reach me. I immediately pressed the call button. After 2 rings, his familiar voice answered. Margaret, I am glad you finally called. I just saw your email, I said quietly. What unexpected request were you talking about? There was a brief pause. Before I explain, Are you alone? I looked toward the closed bedroom door. Yes. Good. A law office contacted me last week asking for confirmation that I still represented you regarding your property. They said there might be documents requiring legal review. I found the request unusual because you had not mentioned selling your home or transferring ownership. I closed my eyes for a moment. I never authorized anyone to do either of those things. That is exactly why I emailed you, he replied. I told them I could not discuss your affairs without your permission. They seemed disappointed but remained professional. Did they tell you who their client was? Another pause followed. No. They only said they were assisting with a planned property transition. I thanked him and promised to contact him again after returning home. Before ending the call, he added one sentence that settled heavily in my mind. Margaret, whatever someone is planning, do not sign anything until we speak in person. I slipped my phone into my pocket just as someone knocked softly on my bedroom door. It was Ethan. Grandma, everybody is getting ready for the campfire tonight, he said with his usual smile. Mom asked if you were coming. I smiled back. Of course I am. He ran down the hallway without noticing the concern on my face. That evening, the resort hosted a lakeside campfire with music, roasted marshmallows, and families gathered beneath a sky filled with stars. It should have been my favorite night of the trip. Instead, I found myself watching people instead of the fire. David disappeared twice to answer phone calls. Laura barely touched her food. Whenever they thought nobody was looking, they exchanged quiet glances that lasted only a second before both of them looked away. I decided not to confront them. Not yet. If they believed I remained unaware, they would continue making mistakes. After the campfire ended, everyone slowly walked back toward the cabins. Ethan raced ahead with several children he had met at the resort. Laura stopped to speak with another family. David continued toward the parking area alone. Without thinking, I slowed my pace. He opened the rear door of their SUV and placed the familiar manila envelope inside a black leather briefcase. Then he looked around carefully before locking the vehicle. His behavior confirmed what my instincts had been telling me all week. He was protecting those documents more carefully than anything else he had brought on the trip. The next morning, our final full day at the resort, I woke before sunrise intending to enjoy one last quiet walk around the lake. As I stepped outside my cabin, I noticed someone standing beside David's vehicle. It was not Laura. It was a man wearing a gray business suit, holding a slim leather portfolio, and looking directly at the locked SUV as though he had arrived there for a very specific reason. I remained where I was, partially hidden by the shadow of the porch, watching the man beside David's vehicle. He looked to be in his late 50s, neatly dressed in a gray suit that seemed strangely formal for a mountain resort filled with families wearing hiking boots and sweatshirts. He checked his watch, glanced toward the cabins, then pulled out his phone. A few moments later, David stepped outside carrying a cup of coffee. The two men shook hands as though they had met before. I could not hear their conversation from where I stood, but I noticed David unlock the SUV with his key fob. Instead of opening the driver's door, he walked directly to the back and removed the black leather briefcase that contained the manila envelope. My first instinct was to walk over and demand an explanation. Instead, I reminded myself of something my late husband used to say whenever business negotiations became tense. The first person to lose patience usually loses the advantage. I quietly turned away before either man noticed me and continued my walk around the lake. 20 minutes later, when I returned, both men were gone. At breakfast, everyone behaved as though the morning had been perfectly ordinary. Ethan happily talked about renting bicycles after lunch. Laura smiled whenever our eyes met, but her smile seemed weighed down by worry. David looked tired. The confident expression he had worn earlier in the week had been replaced by someone constantly calculating his next move. Halfway through breakfast, he excused himself again, claiming he needed to answer another business call. This time I watched Laura instead of David. The moment he left, she stared down at her untouched plate. She did not notice me until I quietly asked, "How many more surprises should I expect before we go home?" She looked startled. "Mom, please do not do this here." "Then tell me when," I replied calmly, because every answer I receive raises two more questions. She reached for my hand, but stopped before touching it. I never wanted this trip to become like this. "Like what?" I asked. She whispered so softly, I almost missed the words. "Complicated." Before I could ask another question, Ethan returned carrying a disposable camera he had bought from the resort gift shop. Grandma smiled. I turned toward him just as he pressed the button. The flash startled everyone at the table, and Ethan laughed. Now I have proof that everybody came on vacation together, he said proudly. His innocent remark hit me harder than he could have imagined. Proof. That was exactly what I needed. After breakfast, I excused myself and found Carol sitting outside her cabin reading a novel. I told her everything that had happened since our last conversation, including the call with my attorney and the meeting beside the SUV. She listened carefully before saying something I had not considered. Margaret, if someone is trying to persuade you to sign documents, they must believe you do not already have independent legal advice. That gives you an advantage they do not know about. She was right. For the first time all week, I realized I did not have to react. I could prepare. As I walked back toward the main lodge, my phone vibrated with a new email from my attorney. It contained only one sentence. I have identified the law firm that contacted me, and there is something about their client that you need to see as soon as possible. The message from my attorney stayed on my mind for the rest of the afternoon. I wanted to call him immediately, but I knew I needed privacy. David and Laura had become unusually attentive, almost as if they were making sure I was never alone for very long. They invited me to join every activity, every meal, every walk along the lake. A week earlier, I would have thought they were simply being thoughtful. Now it felt different. It felt like supervision. I accepted every invitation with a smile. If they believed I was suspicious, they would become more careful. If they believed everything was normal, they might become careless. That evening, the resort hosted a farewell dinner for guests leaving the following morning. Long tables were arranged beneath strings of lights overlooking the water. Families laughed, children chased one another across the lawn, and a local musician played soft country songs in the background. It should have been the perfect ending to a beautiful vacation. Instead, I found myself noticing details that everyone else ignored. David checked his phone every few minutes. Laura barely ate. Ethan happily showed everyone the photographs he had taken with his disposable camera. This one is my favorite, he said proudly, handing the camera to the resort employee who had agreed to develop a few preview prints using a small instant printer in the gift shop. Everyone gathered around as the first photographs slowly appeared. There we were feeding ducks. Another showed us standing by the lake. Then one photograph made David suddenly reach for the stack. Let me see those, he said much too quickly. Ethan looked confused. I just wanted Grandma to have copies. David forced a smile. Of course she will. But before he could collect them, Ethan handed one directly to me. At first I only saw myself smiling near the picnic tables. Then I noticed something in the background. Several yards behind me, almost hidden by a line of parked vehicles, stood David speaking with the same gray-suited man I had seen that morning. The black leather briefcase rested on the hood of the SUV between them, and the man appeared to be pointing at a folder that had been removed from it. Neither of them realized Ethan had accidentally captured them in the frame. David looked at the photograph for only a second before saying, "That one did not come out very well." His voice sounded calm, but I noticed the tension in his jaw. I quietly slipped the photograph into my sweater pocket. "I think it came out perfectly," I replied. Nobody said another word. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stepped outside onto the empty porch and finally called my attorney. He answered immediately. "Margaret," he said, "I was hoping you would call tonight. You said there was something about the client I needed to know." "Yes," he replied. I confirmed the identity of the law firm. They were not representing a buyer. They were preparing documents for a family asset transfer. The proposed recipient was not a corporation, not an investment company, and not a trust. I gripped the porch railing a little tighter. "Then who was it?" There was a brief silence before he answered. "Margaret, according to the paperwork, the property was supposed to be transferred directly into Laura's name." For several seconds I could not speak. I thanked my attorney, ended the call, and remained alone on the porch while the cool mountain air settled around me. The answer I had been searching for all week was finally beginning to take shape. My house had not been targeted by strangers. It had been placed at the center of a plan involving the people I trusted most. The following morning, we packed our suitcases and prepared to leave the resort. Everyone acted as though the vacation had been a success. Ethan happily carried his backpack from the cabin, asking if we could come back next summer. Laura smiled at him, but she barely looked at me. David seemed eager to get on the road. He loaded the SUV with unusual urgency, checking several times to make sure the black leather briefcase was safely locked inside. I offered to drive my own car home as originally planned. Laura looked relieved. "That probably makes the trip easier," she said. "We will see you after we get back." I nodded politely. "Actually, I have a few errands to take care of first." That statement was true, although not in the way they imagined. As soon as I left the resort, I pulled into a quiet, scenic overlook and called my attorney again. We arranged to meet at his office the following afternoon. He also suggested that I bring every recent document related to my property and assured me that no transfer could occur without my voluntary signature. Hearing those words gave me something I had not felt in days: control. By the time I reached home that evening, I noticed nothing unusual outside the house. The flower beds were exactly as I had left them. The porch swing still creaked gently in the breeze. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Inside, however, I found a large envelope resting on the entry table where my neighbor had placed my accumulated mail. Most of it was routine: utility statements, community newsletters, a gardening catalog. Then I noticed a certified envelope addressed to me from a law office whose name I did not recognize. I carried it into the kitchen and carefully opened it. Inside was a polite cover letter requesting that I contact their office to finalize previously discussed family property planning documents. My hands became very still. I had never spoken with that firm. I had never requested family property planning. Yet someone clearly expected me to believe those conversations had already taken place. The next afternoon, I met my attorney exactly as planned. He reviewed the letter without saying a word for nearly a minute. Then he opened a folder on his desk and placed two documents side by side. "Margaret," he said quietly, "this is why I wanted to see you in person." One document was the letter I had just received. The other was a draft property transfer agreement his office had obtained through lawful inquiry after the earlier contact. I immediately recognized my home address. I recognized Laura's full legal name as the proposed recipient. Then my eyes stopped on another line near the bottom of the first page. Under the section labeled "Reason for Transfer," someone had typed a sentence I had never seen before. It read, "Transfer requested as part of the owner's previously expressed retirement plan." My attorney slid the document toward me without saying another word. I read every line slowly, forcing myself not to react too quickly. Whoever prepared the paperwork had written it in a way that sounded thoughtful and compassionate. It described a simple transition that would supposedly reduce future expenses, simplify estate planning, and make life easier for everyone involved. If I had not known the truth, I might have believed it was an ordinary family recommendation. What troubled me was not only Laura's name appearing as the recipient. It was the sentence claiming I had already expressed this wish. That statement was completely false. "Can they do this?" I asked quietly. My attorney shook his head. "They cannot transfer your property without your voluntary signature. More importantly, if someone represented that you had already agreed when you had not, that is something we take very seriously." Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with disappointment that settled much deeper. I had spent the entire vacation wondering whether there had been some misunderstanding. Sitting in that office, I finally accepted that there had been planning instead of confusion. My attorney folded his hands. "Margaret, I recommend that you do not accuse anyone today. Give them the opportunity to explain their actions. If there is an innocent explanation, we will hear it. If there is not, you will already have the facts on your side." I thanked him and drove home in silence. That evening, Laura called. Her voice sounded brighter than it had in days. "Mom, we were thinking about stopping by tomorrow evening with dinner. Ethan keeps talking about the vacation and wants to see you." I smiled, although she could not see it. "That sounds wonderful. I would love to have all of you over." She seemed relieved that I accepted so easily. "We will be there around 6. After we ended the call, I telephoned Carol and asked if she would be willing to join us later that evening. She agreed immediately. I also called my attorney, who suggested that if any documents were presented, I should simply ask questions and avoid signing anything. The next day, I prepared the house exactly as I always had for family dinners. I set the table with my late husband's favorite dishes, baked Ethan's favorite apple crisp, and placed fresh flowers in the center of the dining table. Looking around the room, I realized I was not preparing for a confrontation. I was preparing for the truth. At precisely 6 o'clock, Laura, David, and Ethan arrived. Ethan rushed inside and hugged me before anyone else had the chance to speak. His genuine excitement reminded me that none of this was his fault. During dinner, the conversation stayed comfortably ordinary. School, summer plans, the fishing trip, the mountain views. David even complimented the apple crisp and joked that nobody could bake like I could. It almost felt like every other family dinner we had shared over the years. Then, as we finished dessert, David reached beside his chair and lifted a familiar black leather briefcase onto the table. He looked at Laura, who gave him a small nod. Slowly, he opened the case, removed the same manila envelope I had seen throughout the vacation, and gently placed it in front of me before saying, "Margaret, there is something we have been hoping to discuss with you." For a few seconds, nobody moved. I looked at the manila envelope resting on my dining table as though I had never seen it before. David slowly pushed it toward me. "Margaret," he began, "we have spent months thinking about what would be best for you." I folded my hands and waited. Silence has a way of encouraging people to keep talking. "The house is becoming too much to manage," he continued. "The paperwork would simply transfer ownership to Laura while allowing you to live there for as long as you wanted. It protects the family in the future." Laura nodded, although she never looked directly into my eyes. "Mom, we were trying to make things easier before there was ever an emergency." I gently touched the envelope, but made no attempt to open it. "That is interesting," I said calmly, "because my attorney has a very different understanding of these documents." Both of them froze. David recovered first. "You spoke with your attorney?" "Several times," I replied. He also explained that another law firm contacted him about a property transfer that I supposedly requested. Laura looked sharply toward David before turning back to me. "Mom, we were going to explain everything." I smiled sadly. "When? Before the vacation? During the vacation? Or after I signed?" The room became painfully quiet. Even Ethan stopped eating his apple crisp and looked back and forth between the adults. I reached into my sweater pocket and placed the vacation photograph on the table. It showed David standing beside the gray-suited man with the briefcase open between them. "Ethan accidentally took this," I said softly. "Children have remarkable timing." David lowered his eyes. I continued before anyone could interrupt. "Then there was the conversation my friend Carol overheard weeks before our trip. Then there was the certified letter waiting at my house. Then there was the draft agreement that named Laura as the future owner of my home." Piece by piece, the story became very clear. Laura's eyes filled with tears. "Mom, I never wanted to hurt you." "I believe that," I answered honestly. "But wanting to help someone does not give you permission to make decisions for them without their knowledge." David finally spoke. "I pushed too hard. I thought I was protecting the family's future." "No," I replied quietly. "You were trying to control mine." The words hung in the room. Nobody argued because nobody could. After a long silence, I picked up the envelope, removed the unsigned documents, and calmly slid them back across the table. "These papers will never be signed." Then I reached into a folder beside my chair and placed another document in front of them. "Yesterday, I updated my estate plan with my own attorney. My home will remain in my ownership for as long as I live. After that, my estate will be managed by an independent trustee, not by any individual family member. Funds have also been set aside for Ethan's education, protected until he becomes an adult." Ethan looked confused, but Laura quietly began to cry. I walked around the table, placed my hand gently on her shoulder, and said, "The saddest part of this week was never the paperwork. It was realizing that one honest question from a 10-year-old accomplished what months of careful planning could not." It brought the truth into the open. As they prepared to leave, Ethan hugged me tightly and whispered, "Grandma, are we still family?" I smiled, kissed the top of his head, and answered without hesitation, "Always." The truth does not destroy a family, Ethan. It gives a family its only chance to become honest again.